37 years ago today, 5 men, including Bernard Barker, who recently died just a few weeks ago, were arrested at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. for breaking into the office of Democratic National Chairman Lawrence O'Brien. Waiting across the street, the planners of the operation, E. Howard Hunt, G. Gordon Liddy, fled, but they were soon arrested as well. Although that scandal had no impact on the '72 presidential election, it eventually forced the resignation of Richard Nixon. Watergate's legacy still affects us today in ways ranging from domestic surveillance to secrets withheld from Congress to criminal behavior in the previous administration, some of whom launched their careers under Richard Nixon. But even after 37 years, there's a lot of questions about Watergate that remain unanswered. What were the burglars after? Who ordered the break-ins? Why were the Cuban exiles and other veterans of the CIA Cuban operations involved? Today, John Dean is with us. FindLaw.com is where he's writing a number of absolutely brilliant books, worse than Watergate. John, your most recent book
was Pure Goldwater.
I'm sorry, say that again?
It was Pure Goldwater.
It was Pure Goldwater.
What happened is the senator was a longtime friend of mine. His son and I went to school together. When I was working on Conservatives Without Conscience, I was originally going to do that book with the senator. He told me he had a diary that he thought I ought to look at. It had never been published. It had never really been fully assembled. So when the senator and I were going to do the book, his health gave out, so we never did it. But I looked at the diary and I said, this has got to be published someday, and which I did last year. And it really was just a compilation of his material.
Right. I've got to track that one down. I'm curious.
But he had a lot to say on Nixon and Watergate, which is interesting. That was actually to my surprise, was the largest part of the material in this diary. He didn't keep it every day, but somehow Nixon provoked him, and he was a long-time holdout on Nixon, but at the end he gave out on him and just said, I really want nothing more to do with the man. Yeah,
well, there were a bunch like that. What do you think the Watergate burglars were looking for, and why?
Well, I'm reissuing my book, Blind Ambition. It's been out of print for 2 decades, and next month it's going to be in bookstores, and I put a new 30,000-word afterword in it, and the lead part of the afterword is to explain just that. And because I think there are really, Tom, no unanswered questions about Watergate. I think we know everything. The record is complete and quite detailed. It hasn't all been made public, or it's not really all accessible. So what I did is, in collecting this material over the years, decided, well, this is the time to, after all these years, to put this out and collect this material, which I'm doing. It's clear what they were looking for. They were looking for financial information about the Democrats, because long forgotten in this very time frame, the Republicans were being attacked for the so-called ITT antitrust settlement. It happened to be a bogus claim, but Nixon was annoyed because it really was affecting the positive publicity following his trip to China. So he wanted to get that information out. He wanted to attack the Democrats, and I was able to track this in tapes and in documents. And then after the break-in occurred on June 7th, or actually it happened on May 28th, and there was a second break-in on June 17th, both bungled, incidentally. And in the aftermath, he and Haldeman, who pretend to have amnesia about all this, occasionally slip on the tapes, and they know exactly what happened and why it happened. Right. They were looking for financial information to try to discredit the Democrats.
We know now that there was an overthrow, a coup planned in Cuba for December 5th, 1963, that Bernard Barker, who was working for Howard Hunt, also was working with Santo Trafficante, and there was this entanglement with this whole thing.
That is, to me, pure coincidence.
You think so?
These were the only people Hunt knew, and Hunt and Liddy tried to recruit other people who all turned them down. The FBI turned this up after they started investigating Hunt and Liddy, and these were the only people they knew, and they had used them earlier while working at the White House to break into Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office.
Right.
This is the reason there was a cover-up at the White House. Otherwise, I'm convinced that Haldeman, the chief of staff, Ehrlichman, his chief domestic advisor, would have told the president, listen, cut Mitchell, your former law partner and friend and campaign manager, loose. I think Mitchell would have agreed because he approved the second Liddy break-in, but they couldn't because Liddy had used the same men for Ehrlichman for a break-in. And that's why that was, which they initially thought was national security. It really wasn't national security, although I suspect that Bush and Cheney would have declared it national security.
or anything else. Nixon kept asking the CIA for all the material he had on the Bay of Pigs during this era, and Richard Helms kept refusing to give it to him. Any sense of why Nixon was asking for it, or why Helms was refusing to give it to him?
Yes, it's clear why Nixon wanted it. He wanted to embarrass the Kennedys. And was convinced that information would, the so-called family jewels at the CIA, Nixon was convinced would be very negative for Kennedy, and he still looked at the Kennedys, Teddy Kennedy particularly, as his most formidable likely opponent, both in '72 before McGovern did surface, and then afterwards still his desire to not make Kennedy look as good as history had made him.
Right. Well, I'm wondering why did Nixon ask H.R. Haldeman to use the threat of blowing the whole Bay of Pigs thing to get Helms to back off, to ask, to pressure the FBI to back off the Watergate investigation, and then Helms, blew up at the mention of the Bay of Pigs. Helms wasn't involved in that operation.
He wasn't. There's been some revisionist effort to bring the CIA into it. The CIA was much smarter than Nixon gave them credit. And again, it was because of the sensitivity Helms felt about this. And Helms knew ultimately he worked for the president. And if the president wanted this information, he was going to ultimately have to turn it over. So I'm sure that's why he was trying to protect not only his agency, but he was trying to protect the Kennedy legacy, if you will. And, we see it even today, what happens. Leon Panetta, who's certainly an outsider coming into the CIA and now becoming very protective. And I've told people it takes about 100 days for a new guy to come in and get captured by the existing establishment. And we're seeing it happening now with the people in Barack Obama's administration.
Right.
There's a very powerful, this national security community is very powerful and very persuasive.
And they're there long before and long after the elected officials come and go, or the appointed officials come and go.
Exactly. While there's a few changes at the top, the basic elements of the community stay pretty much in place.
Yeah, we're talking. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say they stay in place from administration to administration, and really change very little in their attitude.
We're talking with John Dean. His books, it was Pure Goldwater, Worse Than Watergate, Blind Ambition, Conservatives Without a Conscience. I'm curious, when Richard Nixon told you that he could get $1 million in hush money on this thing, do you have any sense of where he was going to get that kind of money, and did that set off alarm bells? I mean, other than the obvious ones, like as to its source?
You know what's interesting about that? I went in on that conversation to try to convince Nixon to end the mess that was going on. That this was the so-called cancer on a presidency conversation I had with him. And every time I raised something, he would have an answer. Like when he said, I said these guys are extorting us, and no telling how much it'll cost. He said, well, John, how much could it cost? And right out of thin air, I pulled what I thought was a pretty astronomical figure in those days. Today, I might have said $100 million, but then I said $1 million. He said, well, I know where we can get that. Well, I didn't know until years later that he literally, after I leave the office, goes and talks to Rose Woods, and it gets picked up on a tape because there's a microphone still within range, where he's asking Rose in her office, what kind of money do we have in our slush fund? Because he's ready to start figuring out how to raise the money.
Wow. That's absolutely extraordinary. We're talking with John Dean, former White House counsel to Richard Nixon. Mr. Dean, we have just about a half a minute left. I'm wondering your thoughts on today's lessons from Watergate.
Unfortunately, I think they've been lost, Tom. I think for decades the shadow of Watergate influenced presidents for the better. We saw it all break down in the the Bush-Cheney years, and to me that the lessons have been lost,
right,
which I think is most unfortunate.
It seems perhaps we could recover them with an investigation or a prosecution.
Well, just by remembering our history, I think we could recover them.
A good step, yeah, a good first step. And when your book Blind Ambition comes out, I look forward to that.
Thank you, Tom.
I'll keep an eye out for it. John Dean, findlaw.com, a lot of his writings over there, his books. It was Pure Goldwater, Worse Than Watergate, Blind Ambition, Conservatives Without a Conscience, and others. Mr. Dean, thank you so much for dropping by.
Thanks, Tom.
Great talking with you. 16 minutes past the hour.